The Russian capture of half of the Shakhtarsk district in southern Pokrovsk is a development that can turn the tide in favor of the Russians in the battle for the city. While the Russians and the Ukrainians are clashing on the northern flank of Pokrovsk, as well as within the city itself. Everything is on the line for the Russians to gain control over the city, depending on the developments on the northern side of it. However, if the Russians are able to fully gain control over the Shakhtarsk district, then the outcome of the northern battles do not really matter that much, as Russians would have a stable foothold within the city, not just in the central and western parts of it in the residential areas, but also in the Shakhtarsk district, which is the main stronghold of the Ukrainian forces within the city. Welcome back to another update as I cover the latest developments throughout the front line. It is your host Union, and in this one, the Russians have managed to make several advances across the front line. In the northern section of the front line, they have managed to advance within the southern bank of the Volga River line within Vovchansk. In the northern parts of the Donetsk region, the Russians continue their advances in an attempt to gain control over the supply lines northwest of Lyman leading into the city, while the Ukrainians have managed to make a counterattack, regaining some positions in the area. The Russians also storming the fortified positions of the Ukrainians south of Seversk as they develop offensive operations on the flanks of the town. The Russians managed to advance both within Pokrovsk and in the eastern outskirts of the Dnipropetrovsk region, as well as within Stepnohirsk in the southern section of the front line. Starting out in the Pokrovsk direction, the Russians have managed to make a significant advance in the Shakhtarsk district in the southern parts of the city. This advance is extremely significant because it is the main stronghold of the Ukrainian defenses within the city. Not only is it filled with apartment complex buildings, which are high-rise buildings with a lot of apartments within them, which are difficult for soldiers to capture, and gives an overview over the surrounding areas, especially in the southern parts of Pokrovsk, where the Shakhtarsk district covers the entire southern section of the front line. Ukrainian soldiers within this district, the apartment complex buildings within it, had the ability to look at all of the Russian forces moving through the areas in real time from the different apartments within the complexes. Now that the Russians have fully secured the central and southern parts of it, they have secured the southern flank of Pokrovsk. This gives them a safe route for their supplies, not a completely safe, but a much safer route for their supplies going into the city. This completely changes the situation in favor of the Russians. If they're able to gain control over the remaining parts of the Shakhtarsk district as well, this turns from having stable supply lines to having a stable supply hub within the southern parts of Pokrovsk, and it has direct access to the central apartment complex area within the central parts of the city, which will allow the Russian forces to completely secure not just the southern parts, but also the central parts of the city and move on to the northern parts along the railway area. These developments are a direct consequence from the developments that are taking place on the north. The Ukrainians decided to concentrate their counterattack measures and concentrated their forces in the northern parts of Pokrovsk to counterattack on the flanks to get rid of the Russian bridgehead across the river line. This was a smart tactic as it allowed them to free up the supplies going through the northern flank of Pokrovsk into the central parts of it. However, they redirected these supplies for counterattacks in the eastern direction. While the Russians have a significant numerical advantage compared to the Ukrainians, both in terms of firepower, equipment, and manpower, which allowed them to not just hold back the Ukrainian counterattack, but also to continue the offensive operations in the southern parts of the city, gaining control over the western highway, as well as a foothold within the central and western parts of Pokrovsk, and now control over half of the Shakhtarsk district. The main advantage the Ukrainians had with regards to the fighting within Pokrovsk, now that we have established that the Russians have a numerical manpower and equipment advantage, is the fact that the Russians had a difficult time resupplying the forces operating within the city because the Ukrainians had control over the Shakhtarsk district and the numerous drone usage of the Ukrainians. If the Russians gain full control over the Shakhtarsk district, not only will they be able to secure the supply lines from the southwestern direction, but will also enable additional supply lines from the eastern flank through the railway area into the city. which means that the number of supply lines the Russians have available will also increase. This is why the fighting over the Shakhtarsk district is decisive. The Ukrainians would need to either redirect their forces from the northern flank to counterattack within Pokrovsk itself, to destabilize the Russian offensive operations within the Shakhtarsk district and potentially recapture it. However, this risks the Russians cutting off the northern supply line yet again, which would limit the Ukrainian ability to counterattack within the city itself. Therefore, the Ukrainians are in a dilemma right now whether they should double down on the defense of the city, sending additional reinforcements and leaving other sections of the front line vulnerable, or if they should cut their counterattacks and focus entirely on defense. A third option would be to abandon the city, but this is completely unreasonable based on prior Ukrainian acts, as well as the strategic importance of Pokrovsk and Mirnorod, which in the future will have much more significant effects than the loss of the manpower defending the cities themselves. And that is exactly why these developments are so significant, because it is impacting the entire front line, the developments in a single section of it, in a single part of this section. Therefore, the Russian capture of the Shakhtarsk district in its entirety will turn the situation within Pokrovsk, Mirnorod, the northern and western flanks of the city, in favor of the Russians. In the Zaporizhzhia section of the front line, the Russians have made an advance within Stepnohirsk, a small advance in the eastern parts of the settlement, but yet another geolocated footage confirming the Russian presence within it. As for the Dnipropetrovsk region, the Russians continue their advances within the settlement of Ivanivka, gaining control over the eastern parts of the settlement and gaining control over an important choke point that is in the eastern parts, and that is this small section between the eastern, central and western parts, where the Russians now have control over the entire eastern parts, which means Ukrainian counterattacks would have to take place through this singular road from within the settlement itself, which is a choke point, or from the northern road, which has the cover of the forest patches, but any vehicle movement would be discovered by Russian drones and artillery fire. This makes it vulnerable for Ukrainian counterattacks, and therefore the Russian positions are being stabilized here within Ivanivka across the Vovcha River line. To the northeast, in the direction of Seversk, the Russians continue their offensive operations on the southern flank of Seversk, where they've managed to gain control of some fortified positions and are now storming the second fortified stronghold of the Ukrainian forces in the southern flank of Seversk. There were 3 fortified strongholds. The first one has been captured by the Russian forces northwest of Ivano-Darivka. The second one is currently being stormed by the Russian forces, and the third one is on the outskirts of the town itself. Gaining control over both of these fortified positions on the southern flank of Seversk would have the northern and southern flank of the eastern trenches and fortifications east of Seversk exposed, and this will allow the Russians to flank them and storm them from the northern and southern directions. It will also enable the Russian forces to move through the railway section into Seversk from the northern and southern flanks. This will allow the Russians to put Seversk itself in a pincer while they are already flanking the town from the north, where they're looking to cut off the supply lines leading into the town from the western direction. Therefore, we see heavy fighting continuing in the Seversk section of the front line, where the Russians are attempting to develop their offensive operations on both flanks. As for the Lyman section, there are some developments on the northwestern flank, where the Ukrainians managed to recapture some positions within Novoselivka, pushing the Russian forces to the outskirts, but the Russians still have control over the crossing itself. However, they are also establishing a secondary crossing here to the south of Shentryholove along the river line. The Russians are here looking to solidify their positions on the western bank of the river line and continue their offensive operations into Novoselivka to cut off some of the main supply lines leading into Lyman from the northwestern direction. There is the Novoselivka supply line in the north and the Yarova in the south, both moving through Dobryshev. That means the Russians have 2 options, either to gain control over Novoselivka and push into Yarova, cutting them off from the forest patch area itself, or to push in the direction of Dobryshev to gain control over the settlement and cut it off through that. The Russians are so far working on storming Novoselivka, which is to cut off the northern supply road. This is to cut them off one by one following the capture of Shentryholove and Serezhne further north. In the northern section of the front line within Vovchansk, the Russians continued offensive operations south of the Vovcha river line, where they've managed to gain control over additional streets. The Russian forces are slowly developing the offensive operations within Vovchansk, where over the past 2 years there's been a stalemate within the town. Then over the past 2 months, the Russians have developed offensive operations south of the Vovcha river line to gain control over the first patch area, which allowed them to concentrate forces now to storm Vovchansk in the southern parts of the river line. This is to gain full control over the settlement, which can end the stalemate of the Kharkiv region, which has been ongoing since June of 2023, so for the past 2 years and 4 months. Ending the stalemate is a significant development because we are already seeing developments in favor of the Russians on the northeastern parts of the Kharkiv region, both along the border between the Kharkiv and Belgorod regions, but also within Kupiansk, where the Russians are looking to gain full control over the town, which acts as a logistical hub for Ukrainian forces in the area, both on the eastern bank of the Uskar river line, as well as on the western bank of it, both of which will turn to the Russian side with the capture of the settlement, which will allow for further offensive operations within the Kharkiv region. Similarly, if the Russians gain control over Vovchansk, they'll have that as well, which will allow them to launch offensive operations to connect the two through the Kharkiv region and with assault operations across the border area. In conclusion, heavy fighting takes place all across the front line, where Russians are centering their offensive operations around 4 key areas: Pokrovsk, Seversk, Lyman, and Kupiansk. These 4 areas are decisive for the upcoming operations by the Russians, as all of them operate as logistical hubs in their respective sectors of the front line, where the Russians are looking to gain full control over the Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia regions, starting out, and then moving on to the Kherson region in the future, with some developments taking place in the Kharkiv region as well. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.